It's difficult to talk about anything else but coronavirus these days, of course, because it has permeated our life so extensively. And I think at some time we will talk specifically about many of the questions that you have about the coronavirus. I also try to answer those questions by email or on my Facebook page. My Facebook page is probably the best way to have up-to-date information. So you just go Facebook and search for me. But just because we have this horrific thing that has descended on us doesn't mean that everything else in life stops, right? And we still need to be aware of the fact that other conditions have not evaporated just because we're dealing with the coronavirus. And unfortunately, we keep aging. And every minute that passes brings us 1 minute closer to the end. So, of course, we're all interested in talking about aging, what to do, what not to do, etc. So let's talk a little bit about that, about the whole aging process. But let me start first with a bit of a story. And there was a gentleman who was very perturbed because his wife was always wondering about whether he was a philanderer. And one day he went home and she found some hairs on his jacket and decided that he was fooling around. So the next time he wasn't. And the next time he decided to really fix her. So he took off every little bit of hair, every dust from his jacket, and he goes home and she gets more angry than ever and says, "What's the matter?" And she says, "Well, now you're running around with bald women." Well, of course, had made the right observation, but came to the wrong conclusion. And science is all about making observations and coming to conclusions. That's what we do through our office at McGill, as those of you who follow me on all different platforms and those of you who have been regulars at the Côte Saint-Luc Public Library for years know. And we try to separate sense from nonsense, fact from folly. And as you can imagine, that's a difficult thing to do. We have no conflict of interest in the sense that we do not accept any money from any vested source. It makes no difference to me or to my colleagues whether or not any food additive, any medication, any cosmetic is regulated or not. The only thing that matters is that whatever decision is arrived at based on proper scientific methodology, not on emotion and not on hearsay. Aging, it's troublesome, isn't it? And we're doing it. We're all doing it. We would all like to see this slowed down. Robert Browning, a classic English poet, many of you may remember him from high school, with a classic couple of lines: "Grow old along with me, the best is yet to be." So said Robert Browning, but you know what? I think he must have been clowning. Let's face it, getting old is not so pleasurable. Oh, we hear about the golden years, but they're not so golden. They're more rusty, as we tend to have our joints creak and we walk more slowly and breathe more heavily, and more difficulties come up. But you know what? It's still better than the alternative. So what can we do for this aging process, which really does worry us? I mean, every time that we light that extra candle on the cake, we think about all the time that has gone by, and that more has gone by than what is left. Of course, there are all kinds of worries in our life, and aging is obviously one of these. And so what are some of these worries? Incontinence, obviously, is one of these. As we get older, it's more and more difficult to control our body functions. But there are remedies, there are therapies available, and of course, we are reaching much more ripe old age these days than even 50 years ago. Of course, that's a little bit misleading, because a lot of the increase in the average life expectancy is because we have conquered so many childhood diseases that used to take our children away. But there are concerns, of course. blood flow isn't the same as it always was, and we're constantly looking for solutions to those kind of problems. And the pharmaceutical industry does come up with some of these. One of the most successful drugs in history, of course, has been Viagra. And it's interesting, the name of Viagra is interesting. It actually derives from Niagara Falls, believe it or not. Because when the drug was first introduced, researchers were sitting around the conference table wondering about what to name this new medication, and they wanted it to sound very powerful. So someone said, gee, you know, look at Niagara Falls. There's a lot of flow over that brink every second. That's real power. So they combined vitality and Niagara and came up with Viagra, and has become one of the best-selling drugs in history. Now, we know that eventually our body is going to break down. That's a given. And the troublesome part, though, is that the mind also has the potential of breaking down. And we all understand that eventually, you know, we're going to have physical problems. But is it possible to avoid the mental problems? Well, you know that some people live to 100, 105 without any kind of physical or mental problem. And you hear these stories, you know, of a person who lived to that ripe old age, although they were heavy smokers. Well, yes, but these are the outliers. You don't hear about the smokers who met their demise when they were in their 60s. So no, smoking is not a good idea, but we have to understand that everything in life, including longevity, works on a bell curve. There are outliers on both sides of that curve. There are people who live extremely long time. There are people who live very short time. Most of us live somewhere in the middle. So is there something that we can do to try to slow down that clock? Not one thing, but I think there are approaches that we can do. We have been looking for the proverbial fountain of youth for centuries and centuries. Does it exist? Well, yeah, if you go to Florida, in St. Augustine, Florida, you can actually visit the Fountain of Youth. It's a real location. People go and hang out. One would not think that the Fountain of Youth would be found in Florida, because you look around the street and not a lot of youthful people that you say there. But why Florida? Why is this located there? Well, it all goes back to part history and part legend. When Juan Ponce de Leon, who was governor of Puerto Rico at that time, came to Florida supposedly looking for the Fountain of Youth. This was supposed to be some mysterious water that you could bathe in and reverse aging. Needless to say, he never found any such fountain, but the legend was born. I mean, Ponce de Leon really was a real person. Whether he was searching for the fountain or not is questionable, but he did explore Florida, and he saw that it was very flowery, gave it the name Florida from flowers, and it has been attracting people ever since that time. Unfortunately, he did not have a very good end. Ponce de Leon was killed in a battle with the natives, but the legend of his searching for the Fountain of Youth lives on. And when you go there, they will show you the spring that was discovered in the 16th century and has become a landmark. Now, it is very possible that Ponce de Leon, as an explorer, did indeed discover such a spring, but I don't think it has any kind of rejuvenating effects. But it has become an interesting historical attraction in Florida. But essentially, what we're talking about here is a myth, but an interesting one. What about some anti-aging regimens that people have been infatuated with over the years? Let's go back to the days of the Bible. And you remember when King David was getting old, his advisors, his doctors, told him, go and lie with young women. And that undoubtedly had some rejuvenating effect, although these days I don't think that you would get physicians to give that particular prescription. But the Bible does record this. The ancient Romans were also interested in trying to maintain their youth. And they made use of young ladies, virgins, who would be enclosed in a room overnight, because the belief was that their exhaled young breath would have a rejuvenating effect on older gentlemen. So in the morning, the older Romans would open a little window to the room where the ladies had been locked, and they would inhale the breath that they had exhaled. And that was supposed to have a rejuvenating effect. It may have had some because of the placebo effect. I mean, if you think you're going to feel better, sometimes you do. Although I suspect that it would have been more rejuvenating if they had been allowed into the room overnight and spent some time with the ladies. So the Romans did not discover the fountain of youth. In fact, they discovered many things that shortened their life, such as drinking their wine out of lead vessels. In those days, lead was the material that was used to make goblets, and you pour wine into lead. Wine tends to be acidic, and it would leach some lead out from the goblet, and that, of course, would have some tragic results. Indeed, some people have suggested that the fall of the Roman Empire was due to their indulgence in wine that had been contaminated with lead. So no, the Romans didn't find the secret. In the 4th century, Ji Hong in China, a physician and philosopher, recommended medicine made from herbs and monkey brains that would lengthen life up to 500 years. Well, no, it didn't do much for us, and it certainly didn't do very much for the monkeys who had to sacrifice their brains. And then there was Cleopatra. Cleopatra took baths in donkey milk because she said that this would rejuvenate her skin. It gave it a wonderful glow. Well, you know what? There actually may be something to this, because if the milk sours, it produces lactic acid. And lactic acid is an alpha hydroxy acid. And you may have seen that as a component in pharmaceutical products these days. You go to a pharmacy, you buy moisturizing cream. Some of them will have AHA, alpha hydroxy acids, because these acids cause the surface layer of the skin to slough off, and you get new skin building up underneath it. And that works pretty well. Now, I don't think the fact that the milk came from a donkey was critical, but what was critical was that the milk would have soured to some degree, which of course it would have done under those conditions because they didn't have refrigeration, obviously, at that time. So next time you go into the pharmacy or department store and you at the cosmetics counter and you're looking for a cream, you can look for one that has alpha hydroxy acid, and remember that this is what may have given Cleopatra that nice appearance. In the 16th century, Elizabeth Báthory, a countess in Hungary, had a different idea. Instead of bathing in donkey milk, she would bathe in the blood of young women because she thought that that had a rejuvenating effect. Some people will suggest that this was the origin of the Dracula stories, of someone who was absolutely bloodthirsty. And again, there's zero evidence that bathing in blood of any kind has any sort of effect. But it's interesting, all the things that have been tried over the ages. Then, in the Middle Ages, the alchemists came along. Now, when we think of the alchemists, we normally think of people who were focused on turning base metals like lead into gold. Well, that's true. They were interested in that. But the reason that they were interested was not what most people think. It wasn't because they were looking to make expensive gold from cheap lead. Because the alchemists knew that, indeed, if a method were found to turn lead into gold, the value of gold would go down. The reason gold was so valuable was because it was rare. Now, undoubtedly, some alchemists were, in fact, searching for that, try to make money with making gold, but most of them were focused on finding what was called the philosopher's stone. The Philosopher's Stone was supposed to have magical properties, including turning back the clock. And they were looking for all kinds of potions that would have some sort of therapeutic effect. And believe it or not, there was some interesting research that came out of that in 1669, and it all had to do with urine, of all things. 1669 takes us back to Hennig Brandt, a German alchemist, who thought that the secret of longevity could be found in urine. Why so? Because urine had a gold color, and gold as a metal had amazing anti-aging properties, right? Gold does not tarnish. Gold ages very well. Gold coins that have been found at the bottom of the ocean from sunken ships, 100 years old, look as good as today, doesn't tarnish. So Brandt thought that maybe somehow gold held the secret to longevity, and urine had a gold color. So he had a hypothesis. He thought that maybe we are born with a certain amount of rejuvenating material in our body, but slowly, as we get older, we kind of pee our life away as we lose this gold. So he thought that he might be able to isolate it from urine. So one day he took a large batch of urine and he started to boil it down, wanting to evaporate off the water to see whether he could find the Philosopher's Stone, the magical substance that was left when the urine had boiled dry. Well, it boiled, and the sun went down, and they didn't have lamps in those days. And all of a sudden, the globe that he was boiling began to glow in the dark. He thought for sure he had discovered the secret of life. He thought that he had found the cure for early demise. Well, no, he didn't find that. But he did find something important. He had discovered phosphorus, because urine contains phosphates, and when you boil it down and char some of the other materials in there that form carbon, the carbon will strip the oxygen away from phosphate, and what you're left with is elemental phosphorus that glows in the dark. So no, it wasn't the cure for aging, but of course it had a variety of other uses, because soon they were able to make matches based on phosphorus. And of course, as humans are wont to do, they very soon used this invention in warfare and started to make smoke bombs and fire bombs with the phosphorus. In the 1800s, C.W. Hofland had another idea. He suggested that laughter was healthful, and the more that you laughed, the better you felt and the longer you lived. And who can argue with that? Because there's a strong connection between the body and the mind. And the more we can laugh, I think the better off we are. Although I must admit that these days, it is not easy to laugh at what is going on around us, unless, of course, you tune in every day at 5:30 to President Trump's press conference, and there's a lot of humor to be seen there. So he also suggested that sleeping in the proximity of youth was a good idea. And that kind of harkens back to what the ancient Romans said. And I think many aging gentlemen would agree that this might be a good approach. And then in the 19th century, Charles Brasa Card made his contribution. Now, he was a legitimately trained physician. Physiology was his expertise, and he became interested in aging as well, especially when he was in his 70s and he married a very young lady, and he worried that eventually he might not be able to perform his conjugal duties. And he had done some experiments with animals and discovered that if the animals were castrated, particularly in the case of guinea pigs and dogs, if they lost their testes, they would age very quickly. So he figured that there was something possibly present in the testes that was contributing to youth. So he decided to experiment with that. So he actually made various extracts of the glands of animals to see what they contained. And he did some early experiments injecting these extracts into animals that had been castrated, and found that it had an invigorating effect. They regained some of their youthful tendencies. Well, he published some of this information. And as you can imagine, the quacks immediately jumped on this, and they started to market all kinds of testicle extracts as therapeutic products, as rejuvenating potions, without any real evidence. But Brasa Card actually injected himself with some of these extracts, and he said that he felt better. But of course, there were never any controlled trials with this. Serge Warren, originally Russian, but he was a physician who practiced in France, looked into this a bit further. He was stimulated by the experiments that Brasa Card had done, and decided that he would carry out some studies. I mean, they were not long-term clinical studies as we would know it, but he wanted some testes to test. Where was he to get them? So he made an arrangement with the French government for the testicles of executed criminals. And in those days, hangings were relatively frequent. So he was able to get his hands on the testicles of the executed criminals. He made an extract of these, and he injected them into animals, and he found that indeed they had some invigorating effect. And believe it or not, he even was able to find human subjects who were willing to undergo this treatment. And he injected a number of them with these testicle extracts, apparently without any significant negative effects. And they claimed to feel better, but pretty soon he ran out of testes because there weren't enough people who were being executed. So he had another idea. He started to raise monkeys because he thought that these were primates and they were pretty close to us. So he actually started a facility in Italy where he would raise monkeys, and the purpose was to use their testes to make his medications. And again, there were a lot of people who were interested in this and who signed up for the therapy. Now, there were no controlled trials in the sense that, he didn't have one group that he injected, another group in which he would inject a placebo to see what the difference was. So we don't know whether or not it was just a placebo effect or not. But undoubtedly, the monkeys were not very happy with this arrangement. And neither were some of his confreres in the medical community. For example, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who of course was a physician, who we remember well because he, of course, was the author of Sherlock Holmes, the most famous character in English literature. And he wrote one of the Sherlock Holmes stories, one of the short stories. There are 60 short stories of Sherlock Holmes and 4 novels. And The Adventures of the Creeping Man told the story of a professor of physiology. And his children noticed something very unusual. He was going out into the backyard and swinging on trees, limb to limb. They couldn't understand this. So they called Sherlock Holmes into the case, and he eventually cracked it. It turned out that the professor had injected himself with monkey gland extracts and ended up making a monkey of himself. And this was Conan Doyle's commentary on the work that was being done at that time, because he thought that this was really stretching the envelope of science, that there was no safety that had been demonstrated, and there was not enough evidence to start injecting people with these substances. But interestingly enough, it didn't stop there. I mean, many others experimented with ideas like this. Eugene Stine in Austria had somewhat of a different idea. I mean, it was still kind of the same notion that you would want to have some sort of increased level of whatever the testes were putting out in your bloodstream. But his method was to tie off one of the ducts that went from the testes, and so that there would be no release of sperm from the testes. And he thought that this would force the testes to produce more of whatever rejuvenating material there was, because there was no exit for the sperm. I mean, this sounds like a convoluted kind of thing. But he performed a large number of these operations, which basically amounted to a partial vasectomy, where he tied off one of the sperm ducts, hoping to force more of whatever the testes was producing out through the other sperm duct. It didn't really have any kind of sound scientific basis, but he didn't have any problem having men sign up for this, because you know, especially in those days, remember, we're getting older, they were afflicted with more and more health problems, and they were quite eager to sign up for this kind of therapy. He demonstrated it on dogs, so at least, I mean, he was scientifically minded. He did publish some of this, and here's a case where see the dog at the top before this surgery, and the dog at the bottom after one of the sperm ducts had been tied off. And he also showed a picture of a man, and who, at least going by the picture, certainly had some sort of improvement. Oh, it's fascinating what people were willing to do in order to try to get back some of their youthful properties. Sigmund Freud, believe it or not, was a believer in this, and he was one who allowed himself to be subjected to this. He underwent the surgery, had one of his sperm ducts tied off, and he did live to a ripe old age. John Romulus Brinkley in the United States got wind of all of this stuff that was going on in Europe at the time. He wasn't a real physician. He had gotten himself a mail-order medical degree, which you could do in those days. But he thought that the US was ripe for being milked in some sort of way. He knew that people were looking for all kinds of rejuvenating formulas, and he heard about this stuff from Europe. So he had an idea that he would also jump on the testicle bandwagon and start injecting people. However, donors, of course, were in short supply. But he decided that there was another way that he could get the right glands. He had grown up on a farm, and he was very familiar with the antics of goats. And he knew that goats were very horny. And he figured that, you know, they must have a lot of this rejuvenating stuff present in their testes. So John Romulus Brinkley became the goat gland doctor. He would take the testes of goats and make an extract of them and inject this into people. So he advertised widely. He advertised for people who were impotent. He advertised for aging men who wanted to see whether or not they could regain their youth. And believe it or not, there was no shortage of takers. He became a wealthy man, injecting men with these gland extracts. He would sometimes even take the whole testicle of the goat and insert it into the scrotum of a man. He had testimonials galore. People were happy. Now, suspect that this was mostly the placebo effect. And he even talked about a gentleman, a farmer, who had come to him once, saying that his wife had complained that he had kind of become a flat tire. So he wanted a treatment. So Brinkley did what Brinkley always did. He did his goat-to-man testicular transplant. And a year later, he got a letter from this gentleman thanking him, saying how much better he had felt. And not only that, he had even been able to father a son. And amazingly, he called the son Billy, supposedly after the goat that had been the donor of the testicle. Brinkley became a very, very wealthy man from this. He had very few complications because essentially he may have placed the testicle inside the scrotum, but didn't connect it to anything. He started a whole chain of radio stations in the US, even ran for governor, all because of the money he made with the goat transplants. And he did it himself, even though he had no training in surgery. It was, you know, all by mail order. And it is really quite amazing that men would subject themselves to this. I mean, I suspect that he did not advertise that he didn't have very much training. But here he is performing one of his operations, and it is very interesting because it seems that he was at least abiding by some antiseptic techniques, which in those days were not so common. As you can see, he's wearing gloves, he's wearing a gown, he's wearing a hat, and he looks like a real surgeon, which of course he was not. But interestingly enough, all of this nonsense really was the forerunner of our modern testosterone and estrogen therapies, because testes, of course, do contain hormones, and the testes do pump out testosterone. And testosterone is indeed the hormone that is responsible for much of sexual behavior. And as you know, there's a lot of research these days in aging men. They're being tested for the testosterone levels in the blood. And if they're low, they can be given supplements of testosterone. And there is evidence that this can work, that it can have physiological effects. Similarly with women, it's estrogen. Estrogen was produced in the female body, and when menopause is reached, estrogen levels decline. Now, it used to be quite common for physicians to start prescribing estrogen to women as soon as they reached menopause, because it certainly mitigated the symptoms of menopause, and it had a very strong effect on the body. I mean, women really felt better. The only problem was, as was discovered years later, that it also increased slightly the risk of breast cancer. Now, of course, nobody wants to deal with an increased risk of breast cancer, and because of that, estrogen prescriptions, automatic prescriptions at menopause, of course, have essentially disappeared. It is only being prescribed when women really have a problem with symptoms, which does happen. So again, there you have to weigh the risk-benefit ratio. But it's interesting that both testosterone and estrogen do have physiological effects. They're used therapeutically. And they go back to that the silly history that we just talked about. Talking about estrogen, one most widely used ones is Premarin. And the name Premarin comes from pregnant mare's urine. That's where the estrogen is extracted from. These horses are raised on farms dedicated to this. Many of them are in Canada, in Alberta, and the estrogen's extracted. And some of the anti-estrogen activists, and there are such people out there, there are anti-everything activists out there, they will tell you that if you're taking estrogen, it is like swallowing horse urine. Well, this, of course, is total nonsense. The estrogen is extracted from the horse urine. You're not drinking horse urine. It's extracted and it is highly purified. And then it is concocted into a pill form. So the fact that it comes from purity of the final product. So whatever concerns there are about estrogen may have to do with a slight increase in risk of breast cancer, but it should have nothing at all to do with the fact that it comes from horse urine. Human growth hormone is another one that you may have heard about because it is very heavily advertised in many popular magazines. And it makes for an interesting story because it does have at least a foot in science. It all started with an article in the New England Journal of Medicine back in 1990. And the New England Journal of Medicine, as you may know, is kind of the Bible of medicine. It has one of the highest rejection rates of any publication, meaning that of every 20 or so papers that are submitted to the journal, only about one passes muster, only about one is published. many of the others that are rejected eventually get published in lesser journals. But the New England Journal of Medicine has extremely high standards. And any work that is published there means that it has been properly reviewed and by experts, and they have judged it to be worthy of publication. So in this case, the paper was about a study that was carried in men, not a large number, a handful of men over 60 who had been enlisted, to see what the effects would be of injecting them with human growth hormone. Now, human growth hormone is a hormone that is produced by the pituitary gland, the pea-sized gland in the center of our brain. And as we get older, when we are not growing anymore, the production of this hormone winds down. That's, makes sense. I mean, this hormone is needed to foster growth. So when we're no longer growing, the hormone is not needed. So the question was, what would happen if this hormone were not allowed to kind of dissipate in the body? Could extra amount of this hormone have some sort of effect to perhaps get back some of our youth? And there were reasons to believe that human growth hormone had an effect on muscle growth, because of course when you're growing, that's what is happening, your muscles are growing. So there was reason to test it, and they did. And the results were interesting. The men found that they actually benefited from injections of this human growth hormone. For example, there was an increase in their muscle mass and other lean tissue. There was a decrease in fatty tissue, increase in skin thickness, increase in density of the bones in the lower back. So all of these are good things, right? There were some issues here. One issue was that in those days, the hormone had to be extracted from the pituitary gland of cadavers. And there was always the possibility that there would be some viral contaminant in those cadavers. Luckily, none of that happened in this particular case. But the study was stopped after about 6 months because the men began to complain of things like carpal tunnel syndrome and other side effects of the drug. And that was not reported in the press. The press, of course, reported the original study. And eventually the author of this paper had to write a letter to the journal advising them that in fact this had been a short-term study that was stopped early, and that he was not advocating the use of growth hormone therapy in the aging population. This was just a trial study to see whether or not it was worth experimenting further. But because of the side effects that had been found, they decided to stop the study. Of course, that didn't stop the hucksters, who by this time had already established clinics, mostly in Nevada, where they were dispensing human growth hormone. Now, it is not clear exactly what they were dispensing, but it was not human growth hormone, because in those days, human growth hormone was extremely expensive. As I said, it had to be extracted from cadavers. And in the study that I just mentioned, the New England Journal of Study, it cost about $17,000 for each man in that 6-month experiment. So they could not possibly, in these laboratories that had arisen, they could not possibly have been injecting human growth hormone. So nobody knows, because these were uncontrolled, but desperate people, of course, were biting into this. But eventually, the government cracked down on these places that were injecting supposed human growth hormone. But the quacks are always very inventive. So now they have come up with another supposed mechanism. And this is the sale of substances that they call secretagogues. So what are secretagogues? Well, let me explain what human growth hormone is. Human growth hormone is a protein. Proteins are made of amino acids. And a protein is really a chain of amino acids joined together. And a necklace, of course, would be a good analogy, made of different colored beads representing the different kinds of amino acids. And it is known that the human growth hormone is a very specific protein, And it is known basically which amino acids are present in it and how they are joined together. So what these secretagogues are, a mixture of amino acids, supposedly in the same ratio that they are found in human growth hormone. And the idea is that you swallow this, and then the body will take the raw materials and assemble them into the human growth hormone. Now, this is total folly. It just doesn't happen. This is like taking a bunch of windows, doors, bricks, dumping them on an empty lot, and waiting to see if they will assemble themselves into a building, which of course will never happen. The reason that our production of human growth hormone winds down as we get older is not for the lack of raw material. We have plenty of amino acids in our diet. We eat a lot of protein, probably more protein than we need. So we have all the raw materials. What has happened is that the body has lost the ability to put those raw materials together into the finished product because our production of enzymes that are necessary for that process have wound down. So it's no good feeding the body the raw materials to make human growth hormone when the machinery to make that hormone is missing. Now, what about injecting real human growth hormone? There are experiments on the way because now it is possible to produce human growth hormone through genetic engineering techniques. No longer does it have to be extracted from cadavers. And there may be something to this. Of course, anytime that we extract something from genetic material, use genetic engineering, people get all concerned about this. But technology here is very sound. These researchers know what they are doing. We'll just have to see where it all ends up. But there's one other issue that is worth mentioning here when it comes to genetics. What you're looking at here are genes. And genes basically are composed of DNA. DNA is the molecule that has been described as the blueprint of life, and the genes are just made of large coiled molecules of DNA. And it's the DNA that gives the advice to enzymes in the body on how these are supposed to put together proteins. Anyway, everything in life is encoded in the genes. The reason that the ends of the genes here are colored in red is because these are a portion of the gene that are referred to as the telomeres. They're the tail end of the gene. And every time that there's reproduction, when cells divide, some of the end of the genes, of the chromosomes, I mean, what we're looking at here are chromosomes, and chromosomes are made of DNA, and genes are part of DNA. I should have mentioned at the beginning that we're not specifically looking at the DNA here. What we're looking at is the chromosome, and the chromosome is made up of this wound up DNA, and the DNA is what gives the message to generate the proteins. So anyway, when the chromosomes divide in young reproduction, some of the telomeres, the ends, unwind, and with every division there's always the chance that there's going to be some mistake made in copying the DNA into a new cell, and that can result in disease. It can result in anti-aging problems, and there's a lot of research directed at this. But once again, the marketers of supplements have jumped the gun, and they are selling things that supposedly increase the length of the telomeres or provide or stop the telomeres from unraveling. But there's no good scientific evidence for this. There's no danger with these extracts, and in this particular case, it's extracted from a plant. And there is some laboratory evidence that it may have some effect on telomeres, but that is a long way from showing some kind of clinical effect. And this is something that is very important to understand. Just because you can demonstrate something in a Petri dish or a test tube in the laboratory doesn't mean that it's going to do an analogous thing in the human body. In fact, the garbage heap of pharmaceuticals is full of substances that have showed some promise in the laboratory, but never were able to have any kind of clinical significance. So this particular drug is extracted from a plant called the Astragalus, and in the laboratory you can show that it has some effect on preventing the chromosomes from being damaged when cells divide. But again, this is a long way from having any kind of effect on people. The active ingredient, cycloestragenol, has actually been identified. Now, it is possible that in the future, this itself will be able to be used in a pill form. We can't rule that out. But it's way too early to tell. There are a lot of interesting experiments going on here, but they're premature. And as you can see, scientists often get upset with this when their work is used in a way that it was not intended. And here's the classic example where there was actually a lawsuit which challenged the anti-aging claims of this particular product. So there just at this point there's no real evidence for it. But I want to leave you with one final story here, which comes to us from Easter Island. That's an island just off the coast of Chile in the Pacific Ocean. And of course, it has a very interesting history because of these statues. Many of these statues that have been erected hundreds of years ago by natives on this island, facing out towards the ocean. And the question is, why were these statues put up? Well, that, of course, we will leave to historians and proponents of aliens landing there who say that aliens helped construct those statues. That's another story for another time. But the reason that I'm talking about it here is because of a particular organism that was found in the soil of Easter Island. Now, why is this interesting? Well, the natives of Easter Island historically never wore shoes. And surprisingly, they never contracted tetanus, which is an infection that you get from stepping on things, because the bacterium that causes it is found in soil. So researchers began to look into this. And they found that there was an organism in the soil that cranked out a molecule that prevented the transmission of, or that prevented the tetanus organism from forming. And the specific chemical now has been isolated, and Sirolimus is its name, and it has been put into medical practice as Rapamune. So you never know where these interesting discoveries are going to be made. Who would have thought that a drug would come out of the soil of Easter Island after noticing lack of infection, barefoot people there? So anyway, the situation here is that this actually may have an effect in reducing aging or even battling some diseases, because it works by preventing the production of those notorious chemicals we hear about, the free radicals. Now, free radicals are linked to aging, and they destroy nucleic acids and they destroy proteins. Now, it turns out that Rapamune can reduce the damage that is caused by these free radicals. So this is very interesting. It already is being used. Now, of course, there are many other chemicals that are being looked at in terms of preventing aging. And we'll toast some of these to finish off here. The molecule that you're looking at here is resveratrol. It is found in red wine. And there's a lot of intriguing research here about red wine having an effect on aging. That it has been suggested that drinking a glass of red wine a day may be a good battle against heart disease. However, we also have to point out that alcohol is a known carcinogen. And we also know that drinking alcohol, certainly in excess, will trigger various nefarious processes such as cancer of the esophagus, breast cancer, cancer of the tongue. Whether or not drinking a glass of wine a day is beneficial or detrimental is a matter of much debate. Do the benefits of the resveratrol in there, the anti-aging effect, the anti-heart disease effect, do they weigh out the potential carcinogenic effect? And it's hard to say. However, let's just finish off by saying that not everything in life has to be evaluated in terms of, is it healthy for me or is it not? Life is there to be enjoyed, and if you enjoy a glass of red wine, never mind whether it contains resveratrol or not, never mind about the potential carcinogenicity. If it puts a bit of pleasure into your life, let's face it, that is worth it. Especially these days when we're all locked inside, we don't have much to do. And even Premier Legault has suggested that drinking red wine might be the way to go. Okay, so that's it. You're all going to be doing less aging after you've heard this. Go and get your sour donkey milk, bathe in it, forget about bathing in blood, but maybe raise a glass of red wine. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Joe, for that talk. And if people want to learn more about you, I know you have a column in the Gazette, so where can people find that?
The best way is to go to our website, which is www.mcgill, that's mcgill.ca/OSS, mcgill.ca/OSS. And of course, anyone can always email me at joe.schwarcz, that's joe.schwarcz@mcgill.ca. And I also have a Facebook page, and that's where I tend to put up all the new information that comes my way. And you can always find my Facebook page. You just put, and you go to Facebook and you put in search and you put in my name and you'll find it.